Okay, welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the Progressive era presidents. Those three men that occupied the White House during the Progressive era. Two Republicans and one Democrat, and all three of them considered themselves progressives. That's how powerful the idea, however it is in the world you defined it or understood it, that's how powerful the idea of the pursuit of progress or progressivism was at the beginning of of the 20th century. So let's talk about the first one, the one that's most iconic, the one that's probably best known to the majority of Americans, Theodore Roosevelt. Now let's make one thing clear. We're not going to discuss the foreign policy of any of the three. And, well, two of the three had some pretty significant foreign policies. In fact, you could even say that what they did in foreign policy might have actually overshadowed what they did in domestic policy. But we're not going to discuss their foreign policies or the role of their foreign policies on their presidencies. I mean, there's historians that argue that Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to actually have a significant foreign policy. He's the first president of the 20th century, the first president of the modern era, the first president in which the United States, and you could kind of say McKinley before him, except you could argue that that was accidental, but the first president of the United States with the United States as a major world player having a sphere of influence abroad. That's the presidency that Roosevelt assumes. So let's talk a bit about Roosevelt, all these interesting pictures here. He was born in 1858 to a rather wealthy New York City family. He was a sick child. But as he grew up and became a teenager, he became more active, always very involved in sports and outdoor activities, kind of what we would call today an adrenaline junkie. He did have a great appreciation for the physical pursuits. He attended Harvard. While at Harvard, he boxed on the Harvard team, and he also rode. He attended law school at Columbia University, which is back in New York City, but he never quite finished. He was more interested in history and in writing. He wrote his first book, a book on the naval aspect of the War of 1812, at the age of 23. He was perhaps one of our more intellectual presidents. He read voraciously, was very well informed of pretty much the world, and he would end up writing 37 more books in the rest of his life. He was married at the young age of 22 and already a widower at 24, 2 years later. Here's an unfun fact about Teddy Roosevelt. He would lose both his first wife and his mother the same day, Valentine's Day, 1884. This was a big shock for him. It took him a while to recover. Not that long, though. He's remarried within a year and a half of that incident. He first goes into politics at the young age of 25. He becomes a New York State assemblyman at the state government level for a couple of years, and then he decides to move out west, and he becomes a buffalo hunter and a cowboy and a rancher, and he does that a couple of years, and then he eventually returns back to New York City in 1886, where he takes up a job as basically the chief of police, the New York City Police Commissioner at the age of 37, which is relatively young for a position like that. But his rocket is on the rise. Within 2 years, he's going to be appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That's a big deal job inside the White House. A year later, the Spanish-American War, the United States goes to war against Spain for the future of Cuba. Teddy Roosevelt volunteers to go to this war. He brings together cowboys that he knew from his youth, as well as polo players that he knows from his circle of wealthy kids in New York City. And he puts together a volunteer cavalry regiment to go to Cuba. His commission is accepted. He's a colonel in the army. And he actually finds renown and becomes a war hero because of the Battle of San Juan Hill. He uses this to catapult him to even greater heights when he comes back from the war, which is a really brief war, actually, which we're not going to talk about, unfortunately, in this class. Automatically, that puts him in the position to run for governor of New York, which he wins at the age of 1941. At the age of 41. He's not going to stay there very long. Before the year's over, President McKinley, enjoying a successful first term, is going to run for re-election, and the Republican Party makes the decision of tapping the young and popular governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt, to be his running mate. In the election of 1900, he's on the ticket as vice president. McKinley wins re-election. Theodore Roosevelt becomes vice president at the young age of 42. Within 6 months of McKinley's second term, he is murdered by an assassin's bullet. He's assassinated by an anarchist in what's actually a number of high-profile assassinations carried out by anarchists at that time. McKinley's one of several victims. What does this end up doing? Well, you know what happens when the president passes away. The vice president becomes president. And Theodore Roosevelt, at the young age of 42, the youngest man ever to assume the presidency, becomes the 26th president of the United States. Like I said, we were just going to focus on his domestic policies. And domestically, Roosevelt was very much in tune and in support of the growing progressive movement. He considered himself a progressive president. Keep in mind, though, most of the most progressive things that he's going to do is when he is safe and secure in his second term. He is going to run 2 terms. Not really run 2 terms. He finishes McKinley's term, which is the vast majority, about 3 years and 6 months. I guess that would count as his first term. Then he wins re-election in 1904. It's in that second term where he makes his most impactful moves, if you will, in the direction of progressivism. If we could summarize Theodore Roosevelt's domestic policy, which he called the Square Deal, by the way, it has 3 elements, the 3 C's: consumer protection, control of corporations, and conservatism. Conservationism. Let's first talk about consumer protection, which we've already discussed in a previous PowerPoint. For example, thanks to Upton Sinclair and his expose of the meatpacking industry and their practices, and Roosevelt himself, at first doubtful about Sinclair, because Sinclair was a socialist, but he sends one of his people there, and it's absolutely true what Sinclair was talking about. Before you know it, Congress is drafting a bill which Roosevelt signs into law. That very year, in 1906, the Meat Inspection Act passes. It prohibits the sale of adulterated or misbranded livestock and derived products as food, and ensured sanitary slaughtering and processing of livestock. And this was put under the authority of the USDA, and it is still law today. That same year, Congress eventually decides to do something about the folks that were behind the Pure Food movement, and they passed the Pure Food and Drug Act that very year. What does that law do? It prohibits the interstate transport or marketing of adulterated food or drugs. It also prohibits drugs in which the standard of strength, quality, or purity of the active ingredient was either misbranded or not stated clearly on the label. Responsibility for examining food and drugs for adulteration or misbranding fell to the Department of Agriculture's new Bureau of Chemistry under the direction of Harvey W. Wiley, chemist and pure food advocate, the man that put together the group that was informally known of as the Poison Squad. These folks volunteered to be human guinea pigs and test just about every drug on the market on themselves to see whether, it was safe for human consumption. Thanks to them, we have the safety protocols in place for our drugs, and those protocols are not that old. In 1930, the Bureau of Chemistry was going to be renamed to the more familiar Food and Drug Administration. So that was the first C of Roosevelt's progressive domestic policy. The second C was the control of corporations. Like everybody else, he felt the monopolies have gotten out of hand and they needed to be controlled. But highlight that. Roosevelt felt monopolies needed to be controlled or regulated, not necessarily destroyed, like other progressives felt. It was something of a middle ground position when it came to monopolies. That said, Roosevelt earned himself a reputation of being a trust buster, somebody that went out there to do battle with the monopolies and bust them up, and he did some of that. Reminder, whenever you hear the word trust, particularly in the context of the Gilded Age of the Progressive Era, to make things simple for you, it's basically synonymous with monopoly. But it does have a specific definition. A trust is when a group of stockholders in several companies transfer all their shares to a group of trustees that hold those shares in common. In return, those stockholders receive stock representing a share of the consolidated earnings of this new jointly managed company called a trust. And it just so happens that trusts commonly came to monopolize major industries and stifle competition, and that's why they came to be known synonymously as one and the same. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 outlawed the formation of trusts. So what is Roosevelt going to do about this? Well, he's going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been around for a while but had not been used until now. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt's going to sue over 45 companies under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, most famously being Standard Oil, which was forced to break up into 36 smaller companies that would compete with one another. In 1902, in his first term, he stopped the formation via merger. That's when two companies come together to form a larger one. He stopped the formation of the J.P. Morgan-owned Northern Securities Company, which threatened to monopolize transportation in the Northwest United States. The following year, in 1903, he created the Department of Commerce and Labor, which in the future would be divided into two separate departments. This department, while Roosevelt was president, would regulate the trust, while the Bureau of Corporations, which was inside the Department of Commerce and Labor, had the power to investigate them. In 1906, Congress passed the Hepburn Act, which allowed the president to strengthen the authority of the Interstate Commerce Commission. And that's the second C of Roosevelt's progressive domestic policy. And let's move on to, an event that occurs within the context of monopolies and corporations, what have you. And pay attention because it's going to make a difference later. We already know there were a number of financial crises, economic crises the country had gone through since the Civil War. You had the Long Depression of the 1870s. You had the Panic of 92. Here comes 1907. And it looks like we're on the cusp of another one. Already the country had begun to sink into recession, economic recession. And then we get a financial crisis. This one was triggered by a failed attempt of an aggressive takeover, a failed attempt to buy United Copper Company. The banks that lent the money to do this, when that money wouldn't go anywhere, they lost that money, and a credit crunch is going to occur. They're not going to be willing to lend out whatever money they still have in their pockets. With that credit crunch, like has happened before, the stock market fell by 50%. Panic ensued. Numerous bank runs and business bankruptcies occurred. People all over the country withdrew deposits from their banks, worsening the credit crunch. Only when J.P. Morgan and others pledged millions to shore up the financial system, like he had done before, did things begin to look like they may stabilize. What this did end up doing was proving how unsustainable it was to continue to have a Treasury Department that could not inject money into the economy when needed. Remember, when we had the gold standard, it was complicated. The government couldn't just conjure money out of thin air. It needed to acquire gold in order to pull this off. This is becoming a hindrance because when you have a credit crunch, you want to inject money into the economy. The gold standard and the rules around it make this extremely difficult. The Panic of 1907 is going to get economists thinking, we need to come up with something so that in the case of a future banking crisis, we need to inject money into the money supply. We could do so without the encumbrance of the rules concerning the gold standard placed on us. Many claim that the Depression was avoided thanks to Theodore Roosevelt, who allowed J.P. Morgan's United Steel to go ahead and buy the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, which at that moment was in debt. And when United Steel bought shares, money was transferred, and money found its way into the economy, and it had a stimulatory effect. So, we were saved once again in a different way by Morgan, but we needed to come up with a better plan, a better idea. We're going to talk about that later. Last C of President Roosevelt's policy. Today we call it environmentalism. So many people would be shocked to find out that President Roosevelt was the first environmentalist president. Maybe that's a stretch, okay, because environmentalism encompasses much more than what Roosevelt considered himself, a conservationist, meaning that he found it worthwhile in the country's interest to preserve and protect those places of nature and natural resources and wildlife that were of intrinsic value to the country and its future. So he made conservation a policy of the presidency and eventually a policy of the federal government. He felt it was important to protect land and wildlife from exploitation and development, particularly by private entities. During his presidency, he would add millions of acres to the national forest system. That's what we had before we had a park system. Congress helped him in 1902 with the Newlands Act, which provided federal funding for the construction of dams, reservoirs, and canals that could open up new lands for settlement and cultivation. The National Forest Service was founded in 1905, and he named his friend and fellow naturalist, outdoorsman, conservationist Gifford Pinchot as the first director of the the Forest Service, which is under the Department of Agriculture. He's not going to be president anymore, but in 1916, when Woodrow Wilson's president, we're going to create the National Park Service as a federal agency that's going to manage our growing collection of national parks. And a lot of this was, and that started, but the impulse that really set it on the course to become a substantial thing was started by President Roosevelt. And there we have it. Consumer protection, control of corporations, and conservation. That was President Roosevelt's progressive domestic policy. So, needless to say, Roosevelt proved to be an incredibly popular president, due both to his successful foreign and domestic policies. He easily won re-election in 1904, becoming the first candidate in American history to receive at least 300 electoral votes in a presidential election. It was at his second term, like I said, that he did his most progressive actions as president. Many believe he could have won easily another term. But because of tradition, thanks to President Washington, who only served 2 terms, he vacillated at first and then eventually said that no, he was only going to do 2 terms. And by doing so, in the upcoming 1908 election, he decides to support his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, for President of the United States. And thus is the result of the election of 1908. It's going to be William Howard Taft, the Republican candidate, versus one more time, I think this is his third attempt, William Jennings Bryan, who loses. And one of the interesting things about this map is, wow, it looks practically like your typical electoral map that you see in the late 20th and early 21st century, except with the colors are switched. The South is predominantly Democrat and the North is predominantly Republican. The only difference between then and now is just switch places. But, you know, you're not, every once, I think more often than not, you get these electoral maps that show this North-South split and demonstrate and highlight how very different the political culture of the North and the South was over 100 years ago and continues to be, because you still see this type of pattern emerge in most elections. So let's talk about William Howard Taft, our 27th President of the United States. He was born in 1857. He's from Ohio. He was born to a political family. His father was a former Attorney General and Secretary of War under President Grant. He attended Yale. He's a big boy, so you shouldn't be surprised to learn that he was the heavyweight wrestling champ at Yale. He went into law. He was appointed a federal judge between 1892 and 1900. After the United States seized the Philippines as a territory, he was named Governor General of the Philippines from 1901 to 1903 by President Roosevelt. When Roosevelt wins his second term, he brings Taft back to Washington and appoints him his Secretary of War from 1904 to 1908. Fun fact, many years later, Taft would become the only president that, after being president, would go on to become a member of the Supreme Court. In fact, he was the 10th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1921. And another fun fact, he was the heaviest, obese, fat, he was the heaviest president we've ever had at over 300 pounds. In fact, there's a rumor that he once got stuck in his bathtub and they had to grease him out of that bathtub. And the other fun fact, he was the first president to have a presidential automobile, first president to have a car, official presidential car, and the first president to have a telephone installed in the White House. And for all intents and purposes, this is what pretty much everybody expected. Taft was Roosevelt's heir apparent, and the expectation was that Taft would continue to work on Roosevelt's progressive square deal agenda. He would be an extension of that. This is what everybody expected in the beginning. Now, does it come to turn out that way? Well, let's continue this story. Taft at first did set out to continue Roosevelt's square deal. In fact, he was a more aggressive trust buster than Roosevelt was. He actually sued over 70 trusts in the 4 years that he's in the White House. He's a one-termer, by the way. He sued Standard Oil, American Tobacco, United Steel, International Harvester, and those are just the big ones. But that's pretty much where Taft's progressivism starts to fade away. Tariffs, once the darling of Republicans. Remember, tariffs are a tool of protectionist trade policy. Tariffs were used to protect American businesses from foreign competition. But opinion is changing on tariffs in the progressive era. Some progressive arguments are that tariffs tax the ordinary working man. That's who eventually ends up paying these taxes through higher, through higher prices. Tariffs also, yes, they help American companies, but aren't we beyond that? We have monopolies now. So could you not argue that these tariffs are actually helping these monopolies stay in power? So the tide is turning on tariffs. Tariffs are starting to look like beneficial to monopolies. And if public opinion is turned against monopolies, now they're starting to turn against tariffs, even in the North. So tariffs, once again, become an issue of contention, and there's new interpretations about these tariffs. Democrats claimed that they were attacks on the ordinary Americans. Progressives said that they promoted monopoly. Taft, hoping to pacify both sides, signs the 1909 Payne-Aldrich Act, which ends up raising tariffs on some goods, lowering tariffs on others, and pretty much making both sides upset with Taft, because he tried to play both sides. This would mark the beginning of Republican progressives starting to withdraw their support from Taft. The Republican Party is split into two factions, the conservative faction and the progressive faction. And when Taft signs that tariff bill into law, the progressives start to drift away. And it's only going to get worse. The Pinchot-Ballinger controversy that very year was the last straw that would definitely split the Republican Party. First of all, Taft believed that conservationism should be managed by Congress, not by the president. Taft would replace the Secretary of Interior, who was a friend of Roosevelt's and a conservationist, James Rudolph Garfield, with Richard Ballinger, who was everything but. Richard Ballinger was a conservative corporate lawyer who within 3 weeks of being appointed would return 3 million acres of public land to private use. An investigation found that Ballinger had also plotted to sell coal deposits on public land in Alaska to a private company. An investigation ensued, and it found that information. Gifford Pinchot, director of the Forest Service, takes this information to Taft. He tells Taft that you have to act on this. The Secretary of Interior is not acting in the interest of his position. And Taft just ignores him. So Pinchot, being a whistleblower, that's what he is, he goes to the press and he demands that Congress pursue an investigation of Ballinger. When Taft finds out about this, he fires Pinchot because there were no whistleblower protection laws in place. Roosevelt loyalists that knew that Pinchot was a good friend of Roosevelt at this point are going to completely turn their backs on Taft. As the progressives walk away from Taft, the conservatives embrace him. Taft just may be the first conservative Republican, or the first modern conservative Republican, whereas Roosevelt was the last progressive Republican. Taft begins to set the pace, he begins to set the mold for what a modern conservative pro-business Republican would be like and prioritize in the White House. He will be punished by the 1910 midterm elections. Those are the elections that determine congressional seats. The conservative Republicans, most of them are going to lose their seats, and progressive Republicans, for the most part, are going to be reelected. And a showdown is starting to culminate between these two factions of the Republican Party. And, from that point forward, Taft is no longer associated with being a progressive, or at least the progressives don't consider him a friend. He very much becomes the new standard bearer for the Republican, the conservative faction within the Republican Party. So Taft's first term is about to end. Up to now, Teddy Roosevelt's on the sidelines, but he's voiced his disappointment in Taft, who he expected was a progressive, who he expected would continue with his progressive policies. And in some cases he did, and in some cases he didn't. Yet despite his disappointment, Roosevelt claimed that he was not going to run again until news broke out that the Taft administration was going to begin to investigate, I told you to remember this, the 1907 merger of U.S. Steel with the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. And the fact that Roosevelt allowed this, and that Taft was going to investigate his old boss's decision, well, Roosevelt takes this personal. And that's when he breaks his promise, and he decides to throw his hat in the ring, if you will, and run for a third term, this time challenging his former heir apparent, Taft, for the nomination of the Republican Party. At the 1912 Republican Convention, despite Teddy Roosevelt winning all 13 state primaries, 13 states up to that point had actually had primary elections, despite Roosevelt winning all 13 of them, the party leaders gave the nomination to Taft. Roosevelt, of course, was not happy, and he took his loyalists with him, defected from the Republican Party, and decided that he was going to run as a third-party candidate under the Progressive Party ticket. This would essentially split the party definitely split the party between those two factions. The conservatives would support Taft, and many of the progressives Roosevelt hoped, would defect and go over to the Roosevelt campaign. Now, Roosevelt at first was hesitant to do this because there already was a third-party candidate running under the label the Progressive Party. That was Robert La Follette, the senator from Wisconsin. But La Follette seemed to have had a nervous breakdown because of family problems, drops out, and then Roosevelt jumps in as the official candidate for the Progressive Party. So now we have a three-way race. It's actually going to be a four-way race, because the fourth candidate in that election is going to be our favorite socialist of the progressive era, Eugene Debs, but we'll get back to him in a second. So the campaign, summer and fall of 1912 are interesting. Taft thinks that he's going to lose. He knows he's not as popular as Roosevelt, so he doesn't even bother campaigning. Roosevelt campaigns like a crazy man up and down the country. Up until October, when a guy tries to kill Roosevelt. And this is one of the amazing stories about Roosevelt. A guy in the crowd pulls out a gun and fires point blank into Roosevelt's chest. But this is what happened. Roosevelt had just finished delivering a speech of several pages, and he folds these pages into a square and he puts them in his pocket. When the guy shoots him, the bullet hits that thick square of paper in Roosevelt's pocket, and it stops the bullet from entering Roosevelt's body. Roosevelt just pauses for a couple of seconds. I don't know if he realizes he was shot or not, and continues to speak unfazed. He wouldn't campaign more after that. But there's an event that occurs just before that, while he's on the campaign trail. And I bring this up just to outline how increasingly progressive, maybe even radical, Roosevelt had become the longer he stays in the White House or pursues the White House. He gives a speech at Osawatomie, Kansas, and this is symbolic. That's the site in which John Brown, many years earlier, slaughtered a group of pro-slavery people. And he goes to this town that John Brown did that, and he delivers a campaign speech in which he outlines his plan if he were to be elected president as the progressive candidate. His new domestic policy platform he calls the New Nationalism. In it he calls for a national health service. Yes, the demand for universal health care goes all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. He also calls for elderly, disabled, and unemployment insurance, which we know of today as Social Security, minimum wage, an 8-hour day, workers' compensation, income taxes and inheritance taxes, farm relief, women's suffrage, direct election of senators, primary elections. Now tell me, how similar does this sound to many of the ideas that were proposed by the populists back in 1892? Or by William Jennings Bryan 4 years later? Or by Eugene Debs every time he ran for president and in 1912. In fact, that was part of the criticism. Debs and other progressives are saying, be careful with, with Roosevelt. He's promising these things because these ideas are popular. Is he really a progressive, or is he a fake progressive? He just wants to get elected. Because many of the ideas of the new nationalism, you can find them on the same platform as Debs' Socialist Party. Except Debs is also calling for governorship of the railroads and the telegraph lines and et cetera, et cetera. And there's an interesting image because it's almost like Roosevelt leads this church, if you will, the church of progressivism. It says Teddyism in the water. We don't see it. And he's trying to drag the Republican Party to be baptized and to be converted into these waters. And all the conservative Republicans are trying their hardest to keep the party from falling, from being converted by Theodore Roosevelt. Well, election day happens, and a lot of disappointment to go around. Long story short, if it's not clear that your party is going to win the next election, don't split your party. If you split your party, the only thing you're going to end up doing is handing the election over to the other party. And that's exactly what happened in 1912. Governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, but also a progressive. But in the sense of Democrat progressive that stems from the Populist Party, William Jennings Bryan, going back to the actual run of the Progressive Party, but also very much a progressive. He wins the election with 42% of the popular vote. He doesn't have a majority of the popular vote. Nobody has it. Roosevelt takes 27% of the popular vote. Taft takes 23% of the popular vote. You know what happens when you add 27 plus 23? You get a majority of the popular vote. But that wasn't going to happen because the Republicans were going through a civil war, if you will, between conservatives and progressives. You should mention also that Eugene Debs knew he wasn't going to be president. But he did this, he ran in order to get those talking points, those ideas into the political space of conversation, even though none of those candidates ever agreed to debate him. Look how his ideas, begin to filter into the space in which we debate, what political ideas are worthwhile or not. This is actually his best performance. Won almost 1 million votes, or 6% of the popular vote, but no electoral votes. In fact, electorally, it was a landslide. Practically the entire country. Electoral votes went to Woodrow Wilson. So let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. Third president of the progressive era, 27th president of the United States. We hadn't had a Democrat in the White House since Grover Cleveland. And not only has this election given us a Democratic president, but also a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate. And that hasn't happened in a very long time as well. Woodrow Wilson was born in the South. And even though he'll live in the North for a good part of his life, his sentiments, his opinions, his worldview will always remain rather Southern. He received his PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University. He technically is our most educated president, our first and only president to actually have a PhD. He would be a political science professor for many years and author of many books. He would go on to teach in Princeton University, and in 1902 he was actually named president of Princeton University. In 1910, he goes ahead and runs and wins as governor of New Jersey. A couple of facts to color in the spaces. President Wilson, some controversy. I mean, he had plenty of controversy. His first wife and first lady, actually, Ellen Louise, died on August of 1914. So I guess that would be, 2 years within his presidency. Don't worry about him, though. Within a couple of months, he's going to start dating a new lady, and within 16 months, he'll marry her. And this was actually very worrisome to the White House. They were afraid if this could negatively impact his public image. The fact that he remarried so quickly after his first wife died. But, you know, nobody seemed to have made a big deal. They made it public 16 months later. More facts about Wilson that are pretty much unfun facts. Even for the standard of his time, the guy was pretty bad in the Department of Race Relations. He was a fervent racist and a believer in white supremacy. Yeah, they all were to an extent. Even, you know, Roosevelt made no secret about how he felt the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon Nordic races, but Wilson took this to new heights, especially in his treatment of African Americans. For no reason at all, he reintroduces segregation into the offices of the federal government in Washington, D.C., a policy that was ended by Theodore Roosevelt. He would end up firing many black federal officials and employees from the federal government simply because they were black. Teddy Roosevelt had the policy that he was not going to fire any black, federal officials or employees. Taft says he's not going to hire any of them, and then Wilson just outright fires them. A defender of the Ku Klux Klan and the lost cause mythology of the South, he actually allowed for a private White House screening of D.W. Griffin's Birth of a Nation, and he gave it glowing reviews. And if I'm not mistaken, he also banned black soldiers who had been fighting for this country since the since the Civil War. He banned them from partaking in any combat roles in any future wars the United States may be involved in. But as far as his domestic policy, and he has plenty of foreign policy too, but as far as his domestic policy, let's focus. 3 priorities. Tariff reform, which meant lowering tariffs, which became the trend at this period. Business reform, in order to preserve competition, and banking reform. With the help of a Democratic majority in Congress, Wilson's able to sign 4 significant bills into law that push his brand of progressivism, his progressive agenda, which he called the New Freedom, by the way. They all have to have a label. This was called the New Freedom. First was the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act, also known as the Revenue Act of 1913. This kind of does 2 things. The Underwood Tariff Act is passed right after the 16th Amendment is ratified. The 16th Amendment allows for an income tax, something that was unconstitutional before. So we're going to get to that a little bit later. But first they ratified the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment authorizes the federal government to collect taxes from individuals' incomes. And since it's an amendment, now it's constitutional. There's 2 things going on here. The president, Democrats, even progressives now, want to move away from protectionist trade policy and tariffs and want to move towards free trade. Finally, somebody's listening to Adam Smith that said, the more countries trade with one another, all countries involved will become wealthier and prosper. Let's trade. But to trade, you have to lower tariffs. But then here's the other complication. Tariffs were a huge revenue source for the federal government. If you drop tariffs, what's going to replace it? Back to the 16th Amendment. The money lost by dropping tariffs will be replaced by money earned by collecting income taxes. So the long-term plan is that income taxes are going to replace tariffs as a revenue source for the federal government. But there's also the progressive argument. It's also popular among progressives because income taxes are going to serve as a tool to deal with economic inequality by allowing for a degree of wealth distribution, taking excess wealth from the wealthiest in the form of income taxes and redistributing that through government spending towards those that earn the least. So it allows two things to happen: to alleviate inequality and to drop tariffs and replace drop tariffs, which encourages trade, and replace those tariffs with income tax. At the end of the day, the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act dropped tariffs from about 40% to where they were, the average, to 26%. It also established for the first time a 1% tax on incomes above $3,000 a year and up to 6% on incomes above $500,000. This tax only affects about the top 3% of the population. Everybody else does not pay income tax. Number two, in 1913, he passes the Federal Reserve Act. This kind of brings back a central banking system, but not. It's almost a decentralized banking system that we need a better way to manage the money supply and to regulate the banking industry so as to avoid another banking crisis. The Federal Reserve banking system is created to regulate the banking system and the money supply by allowing for the creation of a new currency. And it's not new, it's actually an old idea. We're going to bring back the greenbacks, but not call them greenbacks. We're going to call them Federal Reserve notes. And what are Federal Reserve notes, folks? Every dollar you have in your pocket, look at it. Look what it says across the top, Federal Reserve note. And what does that mean? It means that its value is not based on gold or silver or anything that's material. It's based on a guarantee from the federal government. That means the federal government, if need be, is free to print as many of them as necessary if it needs to inject money into the economy to stimulate the economy at any point in the future, and therefore is not encumbered by the rules of the gold standard. Now this currency is the only currency still floating around. But it allowed the Fed to be free to inject large sums of money into the economy when needed. By creating the Federal Reserve banking system, you created this new regime, if you will, this new financial regime that allows the Fed as an organization to put money out there into the economy, usually through providing low interest loans to banks, but also it gets complicated, buying and selling government bonds or setting required reserve ratios. You'll probably learn more about that in detail when you take economics. The president does appoint, with Senate confirmation, the chairman of the Fed. And I'm going to show you a slide later on to show you the organizational chart of the Federal Reserve System. The third progressive bit of legislation that Wilson signed into law was the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. It created the Federal Trade Commission, which is a federal agency that advises businesses as to whether their actions violate antitrust law, but also gives them the power to investigate and prosecute unfair trade practices under the Clayton Antitrust Act. So we essentially create a federal police agency, if you will, whose job is to police the business sector to make sure that monopolies do not form, nor unfair business practices take place, or trade practices take place. And the fourth, which happened in 1914, was the Clayton Antitrust Act, which kind of gives shape and form to the Federal Trade Commission. The Clayton Antitrust Act prohibited business practices such as price fixing and matching and others if these practices lessened competition and led to the formation of monopolies. And that's just the organizational structure. You have a chairman of the Fed who is assisted by 7 members of the Board of Governors of the Fed, who they oversee 12 district banks. The United States, if you look at a map of the United States, it's divided into 12 districts. So it's a decentralized central banking system. And then they oversee thousands of member banks and banking institutions throughout the country. If you want to bank in this country, you got to do so under the authority and supervision of the Federal Reserve banking system. Now, before we close, let's talk about amendments, because Just to get an amendment passed and ratified is a Herculean, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, but it's an incredible task just to get that done. Historically, we've tended to have the most success after moments of crises. The Civil War gave us 3. I guess you could call the Gilded Age was a moment of crisis. A crisis enough that it opened up the door to a moment in this country's history that was a great public willingness to A, recognize that things needed to be fixed, and B, support amending the Constitution. The Constitution can be amended. In 1913 alone, 2 ideas that had been rolling around for a while finally not only passed Congress with the required 2/3 majority, but are ratified by 3/4 of the, is it 3/4 or 3/5 of the states? I forgot the ratio right now. And they become law. The 16th Amendment. There hasn't been an amendment since the 15th. That was the Voting Rights Amendment for African American men. Okay, that was a while ago in 1870. And the next amendment happens in 1913. And what does it do? It allows for a federal income tax. It says the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. And just to remind you, the tax rate was only between 1 to 6%, and it only affected the top 3% income earners in this country. Over time, of course, it's going to grow and expand. The 17th Amendment was driven by those government reformers that wanted to make government more democratic and responsive to the people. The 17th Amendment allowed for the direct election of senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, it was state legislatures that voted for the senator, which ended up with a very corrupt system in place. 17th Amendment ends that and puts that in the hands of the voters. When vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority, being the governor of such state, will issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election as the legislature may direct. That means if a senator steps down or retires, the governor has the right to appoint a temporary senator until the next election. But it's the people's choice now. 2 more amendments, 1919 and 1920. The 18th Amendment is a special one because that's the welcome back present that our soldiers get coming back from the trenches of France in World War I. The temperance movement had been around for a while, since the 1870s. They've been trying to pull this off, and they finally do. What is that? Whoa, 50 years later, something like that. They've been pushing this hypothesis around that if we get rid of alcohol, we're also going to get rid of poverty, we're going to get rid of crime, and families are going to be stronger, and prosperity will follow. Okay, fine, we'll give you a chance. 18th Amendment reads, after 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territory subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Forgive the legalese. What it basically says is that the manufacture, sale, consumption, traffic, importation, exportation of alcoholic beverages will be prohibited by law. And this will allow Congress to write the Volcker Act enforcing this law. 1920, worthwhile cause. Again, they've been fighting since the 1840s for this one. The 19th Amendment. Thanks to the efforts of the suffragettes in 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified, giving women the right to vote. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So there we go. We have talked about the 3 presidents of the progressive era. We have talked about their progressive agendas, domestic agendas, be it Roosevelt's square deal, Taft continuing the square deal, but not necessarily doing a very good job, or Wilson's New Freedom and the four amendments. So I think we're done here. That pretty much wraps things up.